The world knew Lemmy Kilmister as the man who refused to bow to anyone, the indestructible bass player who built Motorhead on a foundation of speed, volume, and absolute defiance. But in 1970, backstage at a venue most people have forgotten, Lemmy stood frozen in front of his greatest idol, unable to speak, unable to breathe. Elvis Presley noticed the trembling young bassist in the corner, walked over, and said something that would echo through 45 years of heavy metal history. What Elvis told Lemmy that night wasn't advice about music or fame. It was a warning about survival. And it changed everything. Because by 1970, Lemmy had already worshipped Elvis for 15 years. He collected every record, memorized every lyric, studied every hip shake and sneer. Elvis was the reason Lemmy picked up a bass guitar in the first place, but the reason he believed rock and roll could be dangerous and beautiful at the same time. But after that backstage encounter, Lemmy never spoke Elvis's name with the same reverence again. He spoke it with something else entirely. Something colder. Something that sounded like betrayal, even though Elvis had only told him the truth. If you want to understand how Motorhead became the band that influenced Metallica, Megadeth, and every heavy metal act that followed, you need to understand what happened in those 5 minutes backstage. Because Elvis didn't just give Lemmy advice. He gave him a philosophy that would define the next 4 decades. Before we dive deeper into that night, please consider subscribing to this channel so you never miss the untold stories behind rock and roll's greatest legends. The idol who shaped everything in 1955. But 10-year-old Ian Kilmister sat in his mother's living room in Stoke-on-Trent, England, and heard Elvis Presley's voice blast through the radio for the first time. It was Heartbreak Hotel, and Lemmy later described the moment as feeling like someone had torn open his chest and replaced his heart with an engine. The sound was dangerous, sexual, rebellious, everything his quiet English town was not. His mother worried that Elvis was a bad influence, that rock and roll would corrupt her son. She was right to worry, but for reasons she could never have imagined. Lemmy became obsessed. He didn't just listen to Elvis, he studied him like a religion. He learned every guitar lick, every vocal inflection, every swivel of the hips. When other boys his age were playing football or chasing girls, Lemmy was alone in his room, holding a tennis racket like a guitar, pretending to be Elvis in front of an imaginary crowd of screaming fans. His classmates mocked him, called him a dreamer, a loser, a fool. Lemmy didn't care. Elvis had shown him that you could escape the gray prison of ordinary life through pure sound and attitude. And Lemmy was determined to escape. By the time he reached his 20s, Lemmy had drifted through a series of failed bands, roadie gigs, and dead-end jobs. He sold LSD to musicians, carried amplifiers for acts he barely respected, and slept on couches in squats across London. But through all of it, Elvis remained the distant star, the unreachable god, the standard against which every other musician was measured and found lacking. Lemmy told friends that if he ever met Elvis, he wouldn't know what to say. He feared he would cry, or worse, so that Elvis wouldn't even notice him. Both fears would prove partially true. In 1970, Lemmy finally caught a break. He joined Hawkwind, a psychedelic space rock band that was starting to gain traction in the UK underground scene. Hawkwind was chaotic, drug-fueled, and experimental, the polar opposite of Elvis's polished Vegas performances. But for Lemmy, it didn't matter what kind of music he was playing. He was finally on stage, finally living the dream that Elvis had planted in his mind 15 years earlier. Hawkwind gave Lemmy his first taste of real touring, real crowds, real backstage access. And in 1970, That backstage access would lead him to the encounter that changed his life. The night everything changed. The details of the venue have been lost to time. Some reports say it was in London. Others claim it was during a festival tour where multiple acts shared the same backstage area. What matters is not where it happened, but what happened. Hawkwind had just finished their set, and Lemmy was still buzzing from the adrenaline, the speed in his system, and the roar of the crowd. He walked into the backstage area, sweaty and exhausted, looking for a drink or a quiet corner to collapse in. And then he saw him. Elvis Presley was standing 20 feet away, surrounded by his entourage, the Memphis Mafia. Even in 1970, when Elvis's career had shifted from revolutionary rock and roll to formulaic movie soundtracks and Vegas spectacles, his presence was undeniable. He was taller than Lemmy expected, broader, more real. Lemmy froze. His hands started shaking. His mouth went dry. This was the man who had saved him from a life of factory work and quiet desperation. This was the God he had worshipped for half his life. And now Elvis was standing right there, close enough to touch. Lemmy wanted to approach him, to say something, anything. But his legs wouldn't move. He felt like a child again, holding that tennis racket in his bedroom, pretending to be someone he wasn't. The irony was crushing. Here he was, a professional bassist who had just performed in front of hundreds of people, and he couldn't even walk across a room to say hello to his hero. Lemmy stood there, paralyzed, staring at Elvis like a fan, like everyone else Elvis had ever met. But then something unexpected happened. Elvis noticed him. Elvis's eyes swept across the backstage area, taking in the chaos of roadies, musicians, and hangers-on. And then his gaze stopped on Lemmy. For a moment, neither man moved. Lemmy's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribcage. He tried to look away, to pretend he hadn't been staring, but it was too late. Elvis had seen him. And more than that, Elvis was walking toward him. The warning disguised as advice. Elvis crossed the room with the same effortless swagger Lemmy had watched in 1,000 films and performances. Up close, Lemmy could see the exhaustion in Elvis's eyes, the weight of fame pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. Elvis was only 35 years old in 1970, but he looked older, tired, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for too long. He stopped in front of Lemmy and smiled, a small, weary smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're one of the musicians, right?" Elvis asked. His voice was softer than Lemmy expected, more southern, more human. Lemmy tried to answer, but all that came out was a strangled sound somewhere between a laugh and a cough. Elvis waited patiently, still smiling that tired smile. Lemmy swallowed hard and forced himself to speak. "Yeah, I'm with Hawkwind. We just finished our set." His voice sounded weak, childish, nothing like the growl he used on stage. He hated how small he felt in that moment, how much of a fan he sounded like. Elvis nodded, glancing toward the stage as if trying to remember the band's performance. "You did good out there," Elvis said, though Lemmy suspected he hadn't actually watched. It didn't matter. Elvis Presley was standing in front of him, talking to him like a colleague, like an equal. Yet Lemmy felt his chest tighten with something that was part joy, part terror. He wanted this moment to last forever, but he also wanted to run away and hide. And then Elvis's expression changed. The polite smile faded, replaced by something harder, something that looked almost like pity. Elvis glanced around the backstage area, at the other musicians laughing and drinking and pretending they weren't watching this interaction. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more serious. "Can I give you some advice, son?" Elvis asked. Lemmy nodded, unable to speak. Elvis leaned in slightly, close enough that Lemmy could smell the cologne and sweat, and something else, something medicinal. "You're on stage now, right? You're a performer. So here's what you need to understand. Don't ever be a fan of anyone. Not me, not anyone. Because the second you put someone on a pedestal, you're already below them. And in this business, you can't afford to be below anyone." Lemmy stared at Elvis, trying to process what he had just heard. It wasn't the advice he expected. He thought Elvis might talk about stage presence or bass technique or how to handle fame. But this was something else entirely. This was a warning. Elvis continued, his voice dropping even lower. "I see the way you're looking at me. Like I'm something special, like I'm different from you. But I'm not. I'm just a guy who got lucky and worked hard. And if you keep looking at other musicians like they're gods, you'll never be one yourself. You'll always be the fan in the corner, shaking and starstruck. Is that what you want?" Lemmy shook his head, still unable to speak. Elvis nodded, satisfied, and he straightened up, the polite smile returning to his face. "Good. Then remember what I said. Nobody's above you. Nobody's below you. We're all just trying to survive this thing." Elvis clapped Lemmy on the shoulder, a brief, almost paternal gesture, and then walked away, disappearing back into his entourage. Lemmy stood there for a long time after Elvis left, replaying the conversation in his mind. He felt like he had been slapped awake from a 15-year dream. Elvis, his idol, his god, had just told him to stop worshipping idols. The irony was so sharp, it almost hurt. But underneath the shock, Lemmy felt something else stirring. Anger. Not at Elvis, but at himself. Because Elvis was right. Lemmy had spent his entire life putting other people on pedestals, treating them like they were unreachable. And in doing so, he had made himself small. The philosophy that built Motorhead. In the days and weeks after that backstage encounter, Lemmy couldn't stop thinking about what Elvis had said. The advice haunted him, gnawed at him, forced him to reevaluate everything he believed about music and fame and success. He had spent 15 years idolizing Elvis Presley, and in 5 minutes, Elvis had destroyed that idol and replaced it with something much more dangerous: equality. Lemmy started to see the music industry differently. He stopped treating famous musicians like gods and started treating them like competitors, like colleagues, like people who were just as flawed and desperate as he was. When Hawkwind toured with bigger acts, Lemmy no longer hung back in awe. He walked into their dressing rooms, introduced himself, acted like he belonged there. Because according to Elvis, he did belong there. Nobody was above him. Nobody was below him. This shift in mindset changed the way Lemmy performed on stage. He stopped trying to impress the audience or win their approval. Instead, he played like he was already at their level, like he had nothing to prove. The bass lines became heavier, more aggressive, more confrontational. His stage presence hardened into the iconic stance that would define Motorhead. Microphone high, head tilted back, eyes half closed, delivering music like a weapon. He wasn't asking for the audience's love. He was demanding their respect. But the philosophy went deeper than stage presence. It infected the way Lemmy approached songwriting, collaboration, and even his personal life. He stopped waiting for permission. He stopped seeking validation from producers or critics or anyone else. If someone told him his music was too loud, too fast, too abrasive, Lemmy didn't care. He wasn't trying to please them. He was playing for himself, for the people who understood, for the ones who didn't need the music explained to them. This attitude would later crystallize into Motorhead's mission statement. "We are Motorhead, and we play rock and roll. Elvis's advice also changed the way Lemmy related to other musicians. In 1975, when Hawkwind fired him after his arrest at the Canadian border for drug possession, Lemmy didn't collapse into self-pity or beg for his job back. He walked away, started Motorhead, and built something that would outlast Hawkwind by decades. When journalists asked if he was bitter about the firing, Lemmy shrugged. "They weren't above me, and I wasn't below them. We just went different directions." Years later, when Motorhead started influencing bands like Metallica and Megadeth, Lemmy refused to take credit or play the mentor role. He treated those younger musicians the same way Elvis had treated him, as equals, as colleagues, as people trying to survive the same brutal industry. James Hetfield once said that Lemmy was the only rock legend who never made him feel like a fan. Lemmy would have considered that the highest compliment. The death of an idol. On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley died of a heart attack at Graceland. He was 42 years old. The news hit Lemmy like a physical blow, even though by then, 7 years after their backstage encounter, Lemmy had built a career on the philosophy Elvis had given him. The Motorhead had released their first album earlier that year, and Lemmy was deep in the grind of touring, recording, and fighting to keep the band alive. But when he heard about Elvis's death, everything stopped. Lemmy locked himself in his hotel room and drank for 3 days straight. Not in mourning, exactly, but in something more complicated. He wasn't crying for the loss of his idol, because Elvis had told him not to have idols. He was crying for the man who had destroyed that idol, the man who had given him permission to be ruthless and uncompromising. Elvis had died young, broken, surrounded by leeches and yes-men who had let him destroy himself. And Lemmy understood, in a way he hadn't in 1970, that Elvis's advice had been a warning about his own life. "Don't ever be a fan of anyone," Elvis had said. But the unspoken corollary was this: don't let anyone be a fan of you either. Because the pedestal cuts both ways. It isolates you, elevates you, turns you into something less than human. Elvis had lived and died on that pedestal, unable to escape it, unable to be just a man. And Lemmy, remembering that conversation backstage, made a decision. He would never let that happen to him. From that point on, Lemmy treated his fans the way Elvis had treated him, with respect, with honesty, with a refusal to play the role of untouchable rock god. He drank with fans at the Rainbow Bar and Grill, played video poker machines next to them, talked to them like they were friends. He signed autographs without the theatrical distance that other rock stars maintained, because he understood what Elvis had been trying to tell him. And the second you start believing you're special, you're finished. The second you put yourself above the people who pay to see you, you've lost. The legacy that refuses to die. By the time Lemmy died in 2015, 45 years after that backstage encounter, he had built Motorhead into one of the most influential bands in heavy metal history. But more than that, he had proven Elvis's philosophy correct. Lemmy never bowed to anyone, never treated anyone like they were above him, and never let anyone treat him like he was above them. That defiance, that equality, became the foundation of everything Motorhead represented. Musicians who met Lemmy in his later years often remarked on how different he was from other rock legends. There was no ego, no pretense, no distance. He treated roadies and rock stars the same way. He didn't care about your fame or your credentials. He cared about whether you were honest, whether you respected the music, whether you understood that nobody was special. And if you understood that, Lemmy would drink with you until dawn. In interviews, Lemmy rarely talked about that 1970 encounter with Elvis. When he did, He downplayed it, called it a brief conversation, nothing more. But people who knew Lemmy well understood that it was more than that. It was the moment that turned a star-struck fan into a rock and roll survivor. It was the advice that saved him from the same fate that had claimed Elvis, dying on a pedestal, isolated and worshipped, and ultimately alone. The irony is that by refusing to be anyone's idol, Lemmy became exactly that. Younger musicians worshipped him not because he was untouchable, but because he was so relentlessly, brutally himself. He never softened his edges, never apologized for his lifestyle, never pretended to be anything other than a man who played bass too loud and drank too much and refused to die. And that honesty, that refusal to play the game, made him immortal in a way that carefully managed rock star images never could be. When Lemmy died on December 28, 2015, just 4 days after his 70th birthday, the tributes poured in from every corner of the music world. Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, bands that had built their entire sound on the foundation Motorhead laid, all mourned the loss. But the most telling tribute came from the fans who gathered at the Rainbow Bar and Grill, Lemmy's second home, and drank Jack and Coke in his honor. They didn't cry. They didn't build a shrine. And they just drank and played his music and remembered him the way he would have wanted. As one of them, not above them. Because that's what Elvis had taught him in 1970. Nobody is above you. Nobody is below you. We're all just trying to survive this thing. And for 45 years, Lemmy Kilmister survived it better than almost anyone. Not by climbing higher than everyone else, but by refusing to let anyone put him on a pedestal in the first place. The advice Elvis gave Lemmy that night wasn't just about music or fame. It was about survival in a business designed to chew you up and spit you out. It was about maintaining your humanity when everyone around you wants to turn you into a god or a commodity. And it was about understanding that the only way to win is to refuse to play the game everyone else is playing. Lemmy understood that. See, he lived it. And in the end, he proved that Elvis was right. The musicians who survive aren't the ones who reach the highest pedestals. They're the ones who refuse to step on them at all.